Hey everyone, and welcome back to Between the Lines. I'm Tyler Gray with my co-host, sorry.
Michael, not King Chan, with the
And
long last name.
before we get started today, one thing we wanted to mention is that as we've been doing this, we've realized that trying to do one podcast a week every single week is just too much for us combined with our jobs and studies and trying to make sure that we're properly prepared for these. So, in the interest of making sure that we give you the best quality podcast we can, we're going to start releasing them only every 2 weeks.
Right.
Starting next week, with the next podcast. So, the next podcast will be in 2 weeks from this one. And today we're going to be talking about bias. And to tell you the definition of bias, here's Michael.
All right. So I've kind of gathered a textbook definition of bias. This comes from Merriam-Webster online. So it says bias, an inclination of temperament or outlook, especially a personal and sometimes unreasoned judgment. I'm using a textbook definition because I think that I think this is useful. You know, it may be the easy route, but I think it's useful. So a bias, it's pretty self-explanatory, right? Like some kind of outlook that colors your opinion. You have opinions, you have facts, and you have opinions, but it's our opinions like that may interpret the facts, right? And everyone kind of has a perspective on life or a perspective on things. Why does this matter for historians? Again, like history is kind of considered a fact-seeking or a truth-seeking kind of field. It doesn't do the same things that science does. It's not a field that focuses on the truth through maybe like mathematical principles or proving things through mathematical equations. But history has sort of a claim to try to explain about the past and how it was. Everyone is biased in doing this, though. As we said in our first podcast, historiography, right? All historians, I keep saying this, but all historians have some kind of bias or perspective. All historians have some kind of method or approach to history. And so identifying their bias is one way to kind of, it kind of enlightens yourself and kind of makes you take a step back. Whether you're in a primary source or a secondary source, it kind of takes you a step back to kind of say, wait a minute, is this, is this aligned with the facts, or am I just reading an opinion? Am I reading a fact, or am I reading an opinion, essentially, right? So that's why it matters for history. And so I think that's going to be my take on bias. Tyler, I'll hand it over to you.
Well, one thing I did want to make note of is that
Okay.
while I agree everyone does have a bias, it is important to note that it is not always the same. Like, you can absolutely mitigate the amount of bias in your work. For example, a scathing testimonial by someone saying that the person they don't like is just a complete idiot
Right.
is a far, far cry from somebody saying my opponent made mistakes here and here in his methodologies.
Mm-hmm.
While both have a bias against that person, there is a different level of bias. One is using closer to objective facts, while one is just complete BS, or, well, it doesn't have any useful information in it. One thing I did want to ask is, from your definition, that bias is, an inclination towards one side of a discussion based on, personal reasons or whatever. Would you consider a lack of information from one side to be considered a bias? For example, like, say there's this ancient culture that used stone for priests' tools and used wood for everyday items, and the stone tools are the only ones that survived. We only have the stone tools, so as far as we know, that culture was all about their priests. Is our account of that culture biased because it's only talking about the priests, even though there was other stuff, we just don't have that information?
Yeah, I say in my opinion, and of course this is just my opinion. I don't really have like a historian backing me up on this, but I say that is bias. That's inherent bias, and that might feed into my perspective that all beings are biased, right? And so I say, yeah, just because we have a lack of information from that civilization, the stone tools survived, right? But the wooden tools didn't. As long as we can identify that kind of nuance in that history, like we need to know that for sure. Like, is it just the stone tools that survived? Like, what if there is any wood? Like, how did we even know this information in the first place? Like, I think that once you identify that part of history, like to kind of clarify that factual history, I do think it is a bias, though. A lack of information is then a bias. Our sort of opinions or perspective on that civilization has become biased because we don't have that information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree that it is a bias. So, next thing we wanted to mention is types of bias, which is a categorization that I personally came up with. It's not a common methodology among historians. It's not some professional, set in stone rule. It's just something that personally I've found useful in identifying, different sort of types of bias. Comes down to basically two spectrums, which can often overlap. One being intentional versus unintentional bias, and the other being aware versus unaware bias. I mean, there is a lot of overlap between the two, but there are some differences. Give you some examples. Like an intentional bias would be a company financing a study that spends the data in a way to make their product look good. They are intentionally putting out the study that is biased for them, that is completely intended. Whereas an unintentional bias would be Herodotus, the Persian historian who got most of his information on Greece from Athens. And since he got most of his information on Greece from Athens, it carried an Athenian bias that he didn't intend. It wasn't because he wanted, a biased account on Greece. It's simply that was where he got his information from, and so he didn't, either through a lack of ability to get information from the other city-states, or simply, not caring, his account is biased, although it wasn't quite intended. Unaware versus unaware bias would be somebody who, realizes that their account is biased. And this is something that historians really need to look into, namely being aware of your own bias. For example, Thucydides, the Greek historian, cited eyewitness accounts, which he was aware could be biased, so he specifically would fact-check them in so much as he could, and would make note of what he could not, and would say how he did his best to try and root out the facts of it. There was still a bias there, and he was aware of it, but he used his awareness to mitigate it. An unaware bias would be, for example, early European settlers in America who thought natives to be primitive due to a lack of technology.
Right.
The settlers didn't think themselves biased. They just grew up that way, and so they assumed that these natives in America were primitive because of the lack of technology.
Yeah, and I'd like to ask the question, and I really hate to put you on the spot, but from my perspective, this intentional versus unintentional, and aware versus unaware, and I think I mentioned this before, maybe like a week or two ago. To me, it sounds like intentional aware are similar, and unintentional and unaware are similar. So maybe could you kind of, since you set up this kind of like spectrum, these two spectrums, could you kind of explain like why these are different? Because to me, it's sounding these two spectrums are just so similar that why aren't they one thing?
Yeah, I originally wanted to sort of combine the two, but after
Mhm.
looking into it, I realized there are examples of, having an unintentional aware bias that so you can't quite completely match up intentional with aware.
What's
Because,
the example?
like how Thucydides cited eyewitness accounts that he was aware could be biased. He was aware of this bias, but he couldn't completely get rid of it, and it was unintentional. He didn't intend for it to be biased. He wasn't trying to specifically
Okay.
sway his audience. That's just one example of how you can have an unintentional aware bias. And like, if I were to write a history of something, I could be aware that I have a bias in I have a particular opinion on the subject. And I
Uh-huh.
can try to mitigate it as much as possible. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to completely erase all shreds of my own opinion. Which means that I would be aware that I have a bias while writing that history,
Mhm.
but it would be an unintentional bias, something that I am aware of but don't really want to let through.
What about intentional and unaware? Can you combine those two? Cause didn't you just combine aware, unintentional? What about flip it over, intentional, unaware?
Intentional and unaware, that one, that would be difficult for someone to intentionally use a bias without even being aware that they are biased. So that one would be difficult.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if that one is possible. But because you could have an intentional and aware bias, or you could have an unintentional and aware bias, I was sort of forced to separate the two.
Mm-hmm.
Because just having the one categorization, you could have, like I said, you'd have somebody who's aware of their bias and is using it intentionally, or you could have someone who is aware of their bias and using it unintentionally. So I couldn't quite consolidate the two completely.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's just something to think about, because again, like from my perspective, they're sounding very similar, but I think you explained, like what your reasoning is behind the spectrums.
Yeah, and these are, something like I said that I came up with, so it's sort of a work in progress and could evolve as I learn more and gain a better understanding.
Right.
Now, one of the most important things with bias is testimony, because so much of history comes from, witness testimony. You have to be very careful in how you use it. And while eyewitness accounts have always been used throughout history, historians as a whole have tended to try to use these testimonies and root out the objective facts from them, rather than just give you the witness testimony straight. Up until around World War II. And the era of the witness by Annette Viorka, I believe, she talks about how witness testimony came to become much more prominent in the historical field after World War II, to the point where it started to replace objective facts. She attributes this to the trial of Adolf Eichmann, a former member of the Nazi SS.
Mm-hmm.
When the prosecutors called upon numerous Holocaust survivors to give witness testimony, in the eyes of the public watching the televised trial, this boiled down the Holocaust to a series of witness testimonies rather than an overview of the facts. I mean, this was, a good decision for the trial, and there's nothing wrong, per se, with witness testimony. It's when you start to use witness testimony to completely replace objective facts that accounts can become much more difficult to sort through the bias of.
Mm-hmm.
Witness testimony is, like I said, important for historians as it forms the basis of most historical accounts. However, when you start to replace it completely, emotional testimony is great for getting the public worked up about a certain issue, but it's less so for seeing both sides of an issue and learning from it. For example, like the internment of the Japanese Americans during World War II. In Larry Schweikart's and Michael Allen's A Patriot's History of the United States, they use very little witness testimony and instead use a lot more detached, objective facts. When they're talking about the internment of the Japanese Americans, for example, they would describe the day-to-day activities of the Japanese Americans and some of the struggles they went through, but they don't specifically have these people's word-for-word accounts saying, this is what I did, this is what I went through. They consolidate that into a more detached overview. Whereas Donna Nagata and Yuzuru Takeshida's essay on coping and resilience across generations relies extremely heavily on emotional testimony and anecdotes in telling the story of the Japanese internment. Both are talking about the same event, but the essay, while no less factually accurate, it does leave the impression on the reader that the internment decision was based entirely on irrational fear and racism, whereas the book, Patriot's History of the United States, details both sides, including the reasoning behind the decision. And like I said, this witness testimony is important, but the reason why we need a more general, detached perspective at certain times is because we want to make sure we don't repeat these sort of things. If, for example, we assume that the internment decision was just entirely rational fear and racism, then we're not really going to see ourselves doing it ever. We're going to look at what we're doing right now and be like, well, this is completely different. We have reason for this. Whereas if we look at it from a more detached perspective and we look at, the confusion after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, people talking about how it was for the interest of national security, and there was this widespread fear of Japanese saboteurs, we can better understand, what they were thinking, and we can recognize if that's going on in our society right now and stop us from doing that again. I mean, we wouldn't want to restrict the freedoms of an entire segment of the population due to the actions of a handful of individuals in the interest of national security, despite the vast majority of those people having done nothing wrong.
Right, and you would call that an overreaction, right? Like, why do we need to single out the whole group, yes, even if just a handful are just innocent, or a handful that are guilty? Like the majority are innocent, but the minority are guilty. But the question isn't it an overreaction to kind of put everyone in a camp?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And just, I mean, I know this is pretty obvious to the audience, but just kind of fleshing that out, we wouldn't want, that kind of situation happening.
Yeah. And so the reason that I say that these detached objective facts are very important and it should not be completely replaced by witness testimony is because we can see the reasoning from both sides and we can understand, if we're starting to do that again. That doesn't mean that both sides are equally valid. I mean, there was, an aspect of irrational fear, and that was a breach of freedom. But if we don't understand why they carried that out and what they were thinking, then we're much more likely to repeat that action. So would you, Michael, agree that in my sort of talk about witness testimony, how the objective facts are very important in the use of witness testimony?
Yeah, I think so. I think I agree with most of what you said. Objective facts have their place, and I don't think we should ever try to obscure these facts. I think that, again, when I was saying like what is bias, I also mentioned that history is a truth-seeking discipline. We try to separate facts from opinion. We kind of want the truth. I don't know if we want the total truth with a capitalized T, but we want to know the truth behind certain events, wars. It doesn't have to be wars, but I don't know, like political events. I don't know. You might even be approaching microhistory territory. Like, why did this divorce happen? You know, like there's something about human curiosity, and there's something about wanting to know what really happened in the past. And if you don't do that, then what is the difference between, written history and then myth? Yeah, like is that our alternative? Like, if we kind of stop being factual, like how do we stop this line from blending myth and fact, myth and fiction? And I think that's important to separate. So I do think that the facts they have a place, and I think that in this kind of eyewitness testimony, we need to be careful. We need to be watchful of the facts, but then also watchful about like the bias, to kind of look at both.
Mm-hmm. So now that we have an understanding of bias and its place in sort of seeing bias in these works, can a biased account still be useful?
Right. Because we don't want to that's the question, like, do we want to eliminate all bias, or like just because a document is biased, like a speech, I was talking about this earlier, like a speech from Ronald Reagan, just because it's pro-conservative, does it mean like that biased account is not useful about explaining the past or explaining about Ronald Reagan? So, but yeah, go ahead, take it away.
Oh no, I mean, any input from you is great. So the job of a historian is sort of to figure out which parts of an account are true and which ones are colored by bias. And that is something that historians will argue about endlessly, about which parts were completely accurate. That said, while an account can be biased, it can absolutely be useful. Even a biased account will often hold a lot of truth in it. I mean, for example, like the story of the Iliad, which was, a mythical story about the war against the city of Troy. This was a biased account. It was a myth, and it was a biased account written by one particular side, or from the perspective of one particular side being better than the other. And yet it still has some truth in it, in that there was, in fact, a war that took place between those two city-states. And Troy, the city, existed, which up until fairly recently we were actually unsure, discovered the city of Troy's remnants. But this just goes to show how, while, it can be a biased account, it can still have these facets in it that are very important for the historical record.
Right.
And even if you can't figure out which parts are completely accurate, a biased account can also give you insight into the attitude of the population at that time, which is also very important.
No, I like to chime in about that. I mentioned the Ronald Reagan example, so that's like a speech coming from Ronald Reagan, and let's just say it is very biased towards the conservative side. The question is, how widespread was conservatism in the hearts and minds of the people? Why was a conservative president elected in the 80s? Was there a surge and resurgence of conservatism? And I think most American textbooks would say yes, like the 80s, with a very pro-conservative Ronald Reagan, most Americans leaned on that. They tend to lean conservative. So, I absolutely agree that a biased account can sometimes show the thoughts of the people, maybe reflect some culture. So we're kind of dipping a little bit into cultural history at this point.
You mentioned when we were talking firstly earlier that you had some pointers for identifying bias. Would you like to share any of them, or
Yes.
maybe some more research?
Yeah. What I wanted to mention, I wanted to mention like some things to know before approaching a document, or some things that might be useful, because we're mainly dealing with documents here. Like we say eyewitness testimony, and that could be a video recording, that could be an interview over the phone, and then you're listening to that interview over the phone, or you're watching that video. But a lot of my training as a historian has been written documents. So I kind of want to limit it to written documents. But when you approach a document, and this kind of goes into historical inquiry 101, but what is the title? What is the year of publication, or the year of creation, or even down to like the day or the month of the creation? If it's like a journal entry, is it dated? Who created it? Like the author. Who is the author? Who is the intended audience? But then who published said, diary? Like was it something like a reprint of a journal? And like a company came later to reprint it, or is it the actual page in that journal itself? Because once you know who this author is, let's just say I'm using Ronald Reagan, and I'm not, I'm not trying to pick on Reagan, but if it's Ronald Reagan's diary, isn't that going to tell you something about his bias? Because he is considered a conservative leaning president, and so I guess my sort of like suggestion, my sort of like, these are things to know before approaching a document, or even watching a video interview. If you know the person is conservative, this author, that tends to help you to kind of identify, okay, well, this document, this historical account is probably going to be biased towards the conservative side. So it kind of prepares you. Don't be fooled. Like maybe Ronald Reagan isn't as conservative as you think, but it kind of helps prepare you, like, oh, okay, well, it would make sense, a conservative president speaking about conservative things. If he's a conservative president and he's talking about liberal things, what does that say about the president? Is he willing to compromise? Is he really a conservative, or is he really liberal? And that might help you with, I don't know, like Abraham Lincoln, or like FDR, these kinds of presidents during wartime, and, how liberal, how conservative were they? Maybe they ostensibly were liberal, but they did some conservative things or something like that. Just what does that say about past presidents? Like, what does it say about the political process? You say you're like on a conservative platform, but you're kind of like working with sort of like the other party, like the Democratic Party, for example, or whatever liberal party, what does that say about the president? And that's giving you more information about the past. So I guess my kind of like injection into like this discussion about bias, I'm just trying to point out that when you're reading these documents, it's pretty good to know about who is like the author, and like what is the title, who's the intended audience, and all those things.
Yeah. The very first piece of advice that I would give anyone for trying to figure out if something is biased, and this applies not just written records, but anything.
Yeah.
Is ask yourself, does the person telling me this have anything to gain by convincing me of one side or the other?
Mm-hmm.
Either it's a company that wants you to buy their product, or a person in a position of power that stands to gain more power by spreading fear and making you think that you need to give them more power to
increase their authority or something like that.
Yeah, to preserve your security. You gotta ask yourself, what does this person stand to gain by convincing me of one side or the other?
Mm-hmm.
And the second thing to ask yourself is, what sort of position in life does this person have? Like, a person who was born wealthy and has grown up wealthy their entire life would have a bias towards the wealthy population over the poorer population, whereas somebody who was born, on the streets and has had a very rough and difficult life, they would be more biased towards the poor population. So you got to ask yourself, did they stand to gain anything by convincing you of a particular side, and where do they come from?
Yeah, and that second point kind of piggybacks on what I was mentioning about like who is the author, like what is their occupation, what's their social status, what do they do, like what side hobbies. I mean, all those stuff. Like, it almost seems like you kind of want to read a biography, right? Like if you're gonna read like a document by George Washington, or like his diary entry, probably reading his biography, and maybe autobiography. I'm actually not sure if he had an autobiography. I don't know. Do you know?
Yeah.
But anyway, like those kinds of things would help. Like Tyler is saying, like who is your author?
And a lot of these things, they don't take too long. I mean, you can always spend more time figuring out more about the author or the person telling you whatever it is. But it doesn't take too long, more than like a minute or two, to gain some basic information on the person or company or whatever. So it's not, and there's not a large barrier to understanding if someone is biased.
Right. Yeah, bias is not something that you need to like be. You don't have to major in it. It pervades in all of us, and we should always be armed with some skepticism to kind of guard against the bias, or at least to identify it.
So, anything else for our listeners tonight, Michael?
I think that's really it. I was gonna ask you if you had an experience with reading a document or if you had an experience with reading a document and identifying that bias, and could you kind of relay that to us? But I'm not sure if we really have the time for that right now.
I can give a quick anecdote.
Okay. And then we should wrap up.
Yeah. The book that I mentioned earlier, A Patriot's History of the United States, was remarkably, I say remarkably because I would assume, something called A Patriot's History of the United States to be biased, but remarkably it was actually fairly unbiased for the majority of the book, providing both sides of most arguments using citations and generally giving you both perspectives up until maybe the last 20 years or so, where all of a sudden they started to only would give very beneficial or positive reviews of conservative presidents, while not really listing any of the concerns about those presidents during their presidency. So, that would just be an example of how I noticed that there was a bias in this book for at least one section of it, because they started to How about you, Michael? Any quick anecdotes before our listeners tune out for the night?
Well, I was gonna say for me, when I don't think I have a pinpoint example of like a document, but when reading Chinese documents, I do read something called a memorial, which is like a letter to the emperor. And so I'm reading this from like the Qing dynasty, and one thing I had to keep in mind when I read these memorials is the memorials are very respectful. They have flowery language, and you have to kind of keep in mind that this is face. This is kind of, you don't want to dishonor your emperor. You don't want to get him mad. It says something about this like power dynamic between the officials and the emperor himself. You want to please the emperor. Like it shows you how important this emperor was, like the mandate of heaven and things like that, to the Chinese officials, to the scholar gentry class. And it's not, and you should take it for face value, because there might very well be an official trying to assassinate the emperor, but he would never admit that outright. So you can't just read these documents and these memorials and say like, well, okay, well, all the scholar officials revere the emperor, because I'm pretty sure some of them wanted power, and one of them maybe they wanted to get along the emperor's side and gain more power. Maybe some of them really just hated the emperor, but they just couldn't say it, or otherwise he'll get killed. So talking about bias, you had to keep that in mind. Like, what is the document you're reading, and what is the nature of the people, like, at the time? What's the history? And it does reveal some things. The use of bias reveals some things about the past.
Well, I hope you guys enjoyed our discussion tonight about bias, and I hope that you will, take this into your everyday life and think about what you're reading and what you're listening to, what you're seeing on TV, and wonder, what sort of bias that thing has. So I hope it helps you out in real life. We'll see you in 2 weeks on our next podcast. And for tonight, I am Tyler Gray.
And I am Michael. Is that supposed to be when I'm supposed to say it? I don't know.
We'll figure it out eventually.
All right.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Have a good night.